Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back after the coffee break. Welcome to day one of APAN 56 still. Welcome to this session. Hopefully you're in the right room. My name is Jamie Gillespie. I work at APNIC as a senior security specialist. The session that we're going to be doing here today is sort of a workshop tutorial session on information security, cybersecurity. Now, I have never run a session in this way before, but I've always wanted to. So we'll see how this goes. So bear with me if things are a little bit different, and we'll work on it together. So first off, introduction to myself. As I mentioned, I do security specialist work at APNIC. If you don't know, APNIC is the regional internet registry for Asia Pacific. So if you have an IP address, you got it from us, either directly or through your upstream internet provider. My role at APNIC is doing a lot of external security work, such as training and presenting at conferences like this. I do a lot of engagement with other parties, whether it be government officials working on computer emergency response teams, or working with network engineers on the actual security of their networks and their computer systems. I also do some work with law enforcement agencies, or LEAs, training police investigators in internet fundamentals and the basics of cyber investigations. I also do some work on security awareness. So for the general average person, not necessarily a technical person in a company, doing some training and material for them so that they can understand security, as sometimes it's the weakest link. Sometimes it's somebody who's working in a non-technical department of a company that may be the target of a scam or phishing attack. With that, I also do some training for some schools in Australia, local schools around me, doing cyber safety for young children, and hoping that programs like that become a lot more common so that children, as they start using technology, are learning about security and safety so that they don't have problems that they're experiencing for the first time. When I'm not traveling, I do some internal security work. That is providing security advice internally at APNIC with our IT teams to make sure that we keep our own networks secure. My work experience, I've been doing dedicated cybersecurity roles for about 22 years now, and a few more years before that, working at a backbone internet provider called UUNet Canada. UUNet no longer exists. However, at the time, back in the mid-90s, UUNet technology in the United States and UUNet Canada were running main backbone connections across the internet before they were then bought by MCI and WorldCom, which then transformed into Verizon as it is today. From there, I moved to Australia 22 years ago, and I started working for the Australian Computer Emergency Response Team, AUSCERT, and I spent 8 years there as a senior security analyst and training team leader. I then moved from Brisbane down to Sydney, worked for Google as a security engineer in their security operations team for about 5 years, and then moved over to Macquarie Telecom in their cloud hosting as a security architect, and then back up to Brisbane with APNIC for the past 6 years. And for most of that time, I've been involved with APAN in one way or the other as well. Now, to start things off, let me just bring up what we have here. This is where we're going to start being interactive. So this session, let me just march my window over here. So this session, the way that I'm going to be running this is I'm asking you, who's actually in the room right now and participating online, what you want to learn about security. And I've wanted to do this for a while because sometimes I will submit a presentation to a conference and the program committee will select it for how it fits in with the program. But then it limits for the people that are actually attending the actual session that they turn up on the day. So for those of you that have taken a leap of faith and wanted to learn something about security, I have you here in the room now. And I've got a tool that we use here, Kahoot. We use it for some different purposes. And I'm going to ask just a few questions. and we'll get some voting, and we'll see what are the most popular topics. And then I'll just pull out those slide decks, or I'll just talk without slides, and we'll go through the session for about an hour and a half. So to start off with, I need you to interact with me. I need you to use either your mobile phone or your laptop computers in front of you. And I need you to go to kahoot.it. So that's up in the top corner. You can scan the QR code, but Kahoot, KAHOOT.IT, and then you put in the PIN number there. This is a really fun application for gamifying and creating contests, but the way I'm using it today, we're not using it in a contest. So there's no scores, there's no competition for this aspect of it, but it is fun when we do that sometimes. For your names, you can put whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. Some people putting in funny things, that's perfectly fine. So I'll just give you maybe another minute or two. Please do participate in putting this in. Even the volunteers at the back, if you're interested in security, you're here for the whole session. So please feel free to vote on what security topics that you would like me to talk about. So yeah, so first time I've tried doing this. We'll see how it goes. Pardon me? I'm waiting for everyone to join, and then I'll hit start, because once I start, people can't join anymore. So what do we have here? Is anyone still working on joining? Just put your hand up if you need another 20 seconds. Okay, two more people joining, so I'll let you join in. Good collection of names and avatars. Okay, there was someone else joining. Last call, is anybody else still joining? Okay, one more. I'll give a little bit more time. If you've never used Kahoot before, it's actually quite fun when you use it for testing knowledge, because people compete against each other. You put up multiple choice, and the first person to choose the correct answer gets the most points, and then other people slowly get less points if they take longer to choose the answer. Okay, Zahi's joined. Okay. Is everyone joined? Cool. It's not super critical. It's mostly for voting. So as long as we get a good representation. So if all goes well, I've never used it for polling like this. I've only used it for competitions in the past. Now, there is a time limit on each question, but it should be long enough for you. So I'm starting off with just to know who you are. So nice and easy. First question, how many APAN meetings have you attended, including this one? So if this is your first APAN meeting that you've attended, please choose red. If you've attended one or two meetings previously, then choose blue, 3 or 4. And if you've been around and you've attended a lot of meetings, please choose green. Cool. So most people, this is your first APAN meeting. Excellent. Welcome. Okay, let's move to the next. So just to get to know you a little bit, I want you to type in, what is your current role, position, job? So for me, senior security specialist, you may be an IT manager, director, network engineer. So just type in, I think it asks you to highlight a word. Don't worry about it. Just click on whatever part you want. That doesn't matter to me too much. I couldn't turn off that section of the game. So you've got about 25 seconds remaining to type in your job title. Okay, last 10 seconds to type it in. Okay, let's see, what do we got? I have to click on show answers, don't I? Okay, what do we got here? Students, professors, network managers, assistant network managers, academics, professors, lecturer, researcher. Excellent. That's a very, very broad collection that we've got here. Thank you for that. Okay, now for the actual voting part of things. So I've broken this into 3 questions. So question 1, which of these topics do you want to learn about? Now, these are multiple selection. So you can choose 1 or 2 or 3. You can choose all 6 if you want, but choose the ones that you are most interested in. Now, these aren't the only topics. I've got 2 more questions of other types of topics that I'm asking for you as well. So choose as many as you want for what are the most interesting topics that you want to learn about today. So you've got about 15 seconds remaining. Last few seconds, make sure you put your selections in. Okay. Oh, of course, it's evenly spread. So green came out the highest, threats and countermeasures to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we've got CIA, and then the next one after that is some cybersecurity basics and policies and frameworks. So those are some of the leading ones. So I'll try and keep an eye on that one. So CIA and basics. Okay, going on to the next question. So this is the same as this one, but with different options. So the same thing, you can choose 1, 2, 3, choose as many as you want, but choose the ones that you want the most. So different security topics here. Okay, last 20 seconds. Make sure you get your selections in. Yeah, unfortunately, I was limited to only 6 options per slide, so I had to break it into 2 different slides for this one. Okay, let's see. What are the highest ones? So we have security for services and then DNS from the client perspective for this one. Excellent. So that's CIA basics, security for services, and DNS security for clients. Cool. Now, one last question. This one's a little bit open-ended. This is basically asking you type in what you want. If you haven't seen it on the slides before, if there's another aspect or topic of security that you're interested in, let me see if I can actually talk to it or not. So type in your ideas. You can put in multiple selections. So don't type in 2 ideas in one box. Type in 1 idea, submit, and then if you have another idea, type it in and then submit as well. So I think it's hitting next for each one. You don't have to put in more ideas. If they've already been talked about, that's good enough from there. Okay, we've got 30 answers. You've got about 30 seconds remaining if you have any more questions or topic ideas that you want to submit. We've got a few people submitting more than one, which is good to see. Now, after we submit these, we're then going to have the option to vote on them in your apps. So let's see how this goes. I've never used this one before. Oh, doing the countdown now. So when you vote on them, you can give a star to ideas. Of course, you can put stars to your own ideas, but you can vote on other people's ideas. And then the ones that get voted the most then rise up to the top. So let's have a look. What do we have here? Okay, lots of very good ones. I'm not going to do the sorting and stuff like that, but let's start voting. So look on your devices, and it's going to let you go through and put a star. If you don't want to vote for an idea, just hit next and just put a star next to the ones and just go through each idea as you go through. So everybody gets to vote on everybody else's ideas. And you've got about a minute and 10 seconds remaining, so make sure you go through the voting. That way we get a good representation from all of them. So 1 minute left. Lots of votes coming in. Okay, 40 seconds remaining. There was a lot of good ideas submitted initially, so it's going to require a lot of votes to go through it. Twenty seconds left. 290 votes. Are we going to break 300? 300 votes. Yeah. Getting you guys to do a lot of work. Okay, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hopefully got the votes in that you wanted. And let's see how they rank. Okay. Threat intelligence, that's the top one. So SK submitted that idea. We've got countermeasures of targeted attacks from Hojay. AI for security from DSAMW. Some good ideas. Cybersecurity and AI, very, very similar. I can see that why that got voted as well. And vulnerability assessment. So first off, that's an easy one. If you're interested in vulnerability assessment and learning some of the basics of that, this room after lunch, I'm actually doing another workshop specifically on vulnerability assessment and penetration testing as just an introduction sort of a thing. So if you're interested in that one, stay in this room. Well, don't stay, go eat lunch. Come back to this room after you have lunch. But yes, those are some really, really good relevant topics there, especially the AI ones. I know there's been a lot of talk around that. Cool. Okay. Let me just add that onto my list here and see what I can cover. I can't promise I'm going to go through all of those, but it at least gives me an idea of what people are most interested in. Okay. Okay. Cool. Excellent. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. The experiment so far is going well. And I think, was that the end? I don't think I had anything else there. Yep. Thanks for participating. Drag that window back. Okay. Now the hard part, I've got to dig up the right slides and bring up some presentations. Hey, security basics. What do we got here? So I like the idea of starting with basics. That was maybe like the second voted topic there, because it gets us through things. Now, the other thing is to get through some of this, I'm going to go a little bit quickly and I might skip over some things because the slides I'm using are sometimes from larger presentations. So we'll see how we go through this. So information security, key thing to take away from here is down at the bottom. It has changed over time. IT security, information security, cyber security. By my definition, they're all the same thing. Some people will give different definitions to each one, and they'll create these circular Venn diagrams that overlap, trying to create more than what there is. It's all the same. It's security of data and computer components and networks, and you just put it all together. If you try and break it up, yeah, it's not going to be productive. Now, there's a couple different things that we can look at for security breaches and why this is important. This is from a really interesting website called Information is Beautiful. We've got the links. By the way, I will be able to share some slides out too, so don't worry. You can take pictures if you want, but I can give you the original slides too. This is a interactive web page. It's just a screenshot, but if you actually go to the web page, it's a really good resource for looking at data breaches and information that has been leaked out and how large the information has been leaked out as well. There's also Have I Been Pwned? These are different type of data breaches. This shows you the data breaches of usernames and passwords. So password databases that have been leaked out, which has its own level of criticality because a username and password gives access to an entire account, assuming it didn't have two-factor enabled, which most people don't. And then another type of data breach that we look at are compromised websites or website defacements. There are hundreds of companies every day that have their websites compromised and their homepages changed, either for a fun message or sometimes for a political message. So we go through some definitions here. Definition on what a threat is. So for here, we have a threat, which is either a circumstance or an event, somebody actually doing something with the potential to have a negative impact on an asset. Now, this can be largely broken into three categories of intentional threats, accidental threats, and natural threats. Now, unfortunately, some of the hardest ones here are the human aspect, because humans can be intentionally a threat, but they can also be accidentally a threat. Now, it doesn't have to be large, it can be small. I'm sure everybody in this room at some time or another has typed just a wrong letter in a command, and it's either not worked or not worked as intended. That's an accident, and it may have caused damage, may have been very small, but that is accidental damage that could happen. So with a threat comes the vulnerability. A vulnerability is a weakness. It could be the weakness in the design or the implementation. This can be anything from the regular software bugs and vulnerabilities to misconfigurations as well. And then if we get up to the application layer, we have web applications that are doing things like not validating their input. These are some of the most common web vulnerabilities right here. Cross-site scripting and SQL injection, because people aren't validating untrusted input. One thing we do have to remember, though, is physical security is important. Now, we didn't get this voted on, so I won't go too deep into it, but without physical security, you don't have good information security. I'll summarize this news story for you. There was two gentlemen that in Sydney, Australia, went up to a data center near the airport, which was being used for airport cargo processing and things like that. And it was some of the sensitive databases that they were using for custom clearance and cargo. They walked up to the front desk of the data center. They were dressed in the uniforms of the IT servicing company. Could we just turn the audio down just a little? I'm just, as I come forward, it's just echoing back. They went to the front desk of the data center company. They were dressed in uniforms of the contractors that normally are there. They presented paperwork that looked legitimate, and the security guard let them in, and they went straight through. They knew exactly where to go. They went into the data center. They spent about 2 hours unracking equipment, putting it onto a trolley, and wheeling it straight out the front door. Now, this was a few years ago. Security was still good at the time, but data at rest, full disk encryption, was not a popular thing back then. Probably wasn't actually even available at all. If you don't have full disk encryption in your data centers, this could still happen to you. Someone could walk out the door of your data center with your hard drives. And it's not just the cost of the hard drives, but it's the data as well. Now, a risk, this is where we put things together. So a threat exploits a vulnerability, leading to a risk to the assets that we're trying to protect. Now, this can be done in a few different ways. There's a typical mathematical formula that you can think about here, where a risk is the threat multiplied by the vulnerability. And we're multiplying here because if one of these drops to 0, then the risk ends up being 0 as well. For example, if you have absolutely 0 vulnerabilities, which is almost impossible, or pretty much is impossible, but if this goes down to 0, the risk just bottoms out and hits 0 as well. So if one of those that's under your control can come all the way down, you're lowering your risk. Now, I'll give you a hint. It's really hard to control threats, especially on the internet, because you can't control every teenager who's bored worldwide. Now, a more detailed view of this is where we start adding in the asset that we're protecting. So you bring in the asset, or sometimes thought about as the impact if it were to be attacked. So the asset sensitivity or severity or the impact multiplied by the threat, multiplied by the vulnerability. And the reason why we do that, let me see. No, I don't have. I had been updating these slides, but I don't have a fancy animation, so I'll just talk it through here. The reason why we add in the asset part here, because if you have the same threat and the same vulnerability, but it's on a production system, and the same threat and the same vulnerability on a test or development system, which one are you more concerned about? Well, the production, of course. The production has a larger impact if it were to be attacked, or the asset of the production system has a higher severity rating for the organization. So by doing this, this lets you go through and assign, you can assign whatever numerical scores and ratings that you want, but this allows you to compare different threats, different vulnerabilities, and see how it stacks up against different things. Because you're not going to be spending your time on the lower risks. You're going to want to focus on the higher ones. the more serious assets, the ones that have more threats out there, and the ones that have current vulnerabilities. And the threat side is when someone put forward and people voted on threat intelligence. So that may come up a bit later. I won't go too deep into that one. It's just a bit more risk. And of course, mitigating is where we mitigate risks. This is where we reduce the severity or the seriousness to it. We generally use the word mitigate because we're not eliminating. It is very hard to eliminate something with absolute certainty. So the mitigating is by reducing a little, reducing a lot, but reducing the seriousness. Now, to do mitigation, it's with different controls. These controls usually come in layers. Everything in computers is layers. You know, TCP/IP model, OSI layer model, security, it's all about layers. One classification of layers is done by a timeline of attack. If you think like a hacker or criminal, there's preventing the attacks up front. There is detecting if they actually happen. And then on the far side of the timeline is correcting it. If something did happen, can we correct and recover afterwards? But there's other layers that you can look at as well. And these layers are more about the type of control. You can have a legal and regulatory compliance layer. You can have physical layer for physical security controls, procedural controls, and of course, technical controls as well. And if you think about layering those different types of controls at different points of the timeline to prevent, detect, and correct, you end up with sort of a matrix of different types of controls. And you want to make sure that you have layers of controls so that if there's a failure of any one, the other layers are going to pick it up. For example, some people will have procedural or administrative controls. You might have policies that say, you know, acceptable use on a network. Well, that's great, but an acceptable use policy on its own isn't going to stop everybody from doing bad things, right? It'll stop some, but it's not going to stop everyone. So you need the layers of maybe some technical controls as well, making sure that you back up your acceptable use policy and technically are preventing the things from being done. But if you only have technical controls, if someone finds a bypass to it, then there's no policy that backs up that says, well, you shouldn't have gone around this technical control. Well, why shouldn't I have? What policy was there to say that? When it comes to defense in depth, I like to think about the castle approach. You know, we have defense in depth of pure technical controls, but defense in depth of all of the other types of controls as well. The example for this castle here, this is a beautiful example. I've never been there in person. It's just from Wikipedia. You've got a moat of water and then a wall. Then you've got some more water and some more walls and some more walls. This is not just one moat and one wall. These are many layers of protection so that if one is breached, hopefully the other ones can withstand attack. I won't go too deep into this one, bars of gold and protecting and stuff like that. The last one that I talk about is threat actor. You may have heard me use the word hacker before, and then I corrected it to be criminal as well. There are some generic terms that we use here. Threat actor is a very common one. This is a person or group of people that are trying to cause harm to your systems or networks. Commonly called an attacker, sometimes called a hacker. Try and be cautious with using the word hacker. The original term of hacker was someone that is exploring and creating and building. And there are still hackathons that are being run to this day that are building events. They are not so much security breaking events. You can also call it a malicious actor. You know, that really implies the malicious intent. You can also just use the word criminal because if they're doing something illegal, they're a criminal. Now, threat actors can be broken into different categories, and you have to think about these different categories because they have different resources, and motivations and may attack you in different ways. You have the opportunistic ones. These are the ones that sort of, come across a vulnerability by accident. Maybe they typed in something wrong into your website, got a weird error message and went, oh, that might let me do something else. So they stumble across it like that. Hacktivists are hacker activists. So these are usually politically motivated, usually for those website defacements and having a public image that they can put out for their political message. We have cyber criminals. These can be organized crime or unorganized crime, just individual people doing things for criminal activity. A lot of the ransomware would fall into this as they are trying to extort money for ransoming a computer. Then we get to the interesting one of nation states and government-sponsored hackers and attackers. This is no longer just for some countries. Many, many countries have both offensive and defensive security capabilities now on the internet. These ones are very difficult to deal with because they are usually very well funded. And of course, we have insiders. Out of all of these, I'm probably the most worried about insiders because these are people who are already on your network with access and permissions, and you're paying them. Okay, now these could be accidental, someone fat fingers the keyboard and does something wrong or, whatever. I've got fun stories on that from a previous job, but they can be intentional. They can intentionally be installing viruses and doing ransomware for someone else. There's been that where criminals have actually sent messages to employees and said, hey, if we give you a virus and you install it on a computer, we'll give you $1,000. Can you do that for us? And that's an insider. Even though it's starting as a criminal outside, they're using the insider who has inside permissions. Could be a salesperson who's leaving a corporate entity and they're taking a copy of their sales database with them, taking all their customer records. So the insiders are the hardest ones to catch because they're already in, they've got the access. And it's even worse if the insiders are IT staff because they're controlling a lot of the access control for other systems. Don't get me wrong, I do worry about nation state attackers too, but the insiders are scary. So that is just some basics and intro. Let me just see if I've got anything else interesting here. This one was in the same slide deck, so I'll go through here quickly. So threats and countermeasures to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So first off, to define it and why these words are thrown together, CIA is commonly seen in security as the CIA triad. It doesn't mean Central Intelligence Agency from the United States. Some people try changing the letters around in a different order. It's always CIA. Every textbook you see on security, CIA. So confidentiality is what we're protecting for making sure that information is not disclosed to people it shouldn't be. Making sure if confidential information is supposed to be private, it stays private and confidential. Protecting the integrity of data is making sure it doesn't get modified or deleted without your knowledge or permission. And then availability. We think of availability really easily from a networking perspective, but when you think of availability of data in general, it's not always 100%, 5-millisecond access for availability. Availability of data means that it's available within the expected time frame or within the expected bound. The example I use here is if you are backing up your data to tape and then taking your tape to a remote location, which is a good idea, by the way, it's going to take time to restore that tape. It's going to take time to request it, to have it shipped back to your location, load it into a drive, actually read the data off that drive, off the tape, and then restore it onto a system, then to bring up a system and everything else that might be involved. If you're expecting it's going to take 4 hours, if it does take 4 hours, that's still good availability. So availability for different data means different things. Now, when we come down to information security and we look at maybe doing threat modeling for different systems or products, and we worry about what we're doing here, most of it gets broken down to these three things. If we look at what we are protecting, are we protecting the confidentiality, the integrity, or the availability, or a mixture of these? Now, there is a couple extras that can be thrown in. There's even more. Non-repudiation, we don't go too deep into this. This is basically high-end cryptography for this one, but it's the prevention of either a sender or a receiver from denying that they either sent or received a message. So if you can do, if you've got S-MIME set up within your organization and you can send encrypted emails, in theory, if you're the only one with your private key, if you sign and or encrypt an email and send it, that is proof that it came from you. Nobody else should be able to sign an email from you, because to sign an email or encrypt an email requires your private key. But if you don't have an absolute 100% control over your private key, the non-repudiation isn't there as much. Safety is probably the next most important one that sort of gets added on. CIA was great when we were dealing with pure computer systems, but as computer systems have real world impact, we do have to think about the safety of those systems into the physical world. Primary concern that I put here is things like autonomous vehicles. You know, if you're dealing with an internet connected car and you can disable its brakes remotely, you've got a little bit more to worry about than strict CIA. You have to worry about that safety side as well. So some of the protections for it. So for confidentiality, common attacks. I won't talk about the attacks too much. I'll skip through those. So the common defenses here for confidentiality, this is where we use access control and encryption. Now, different things for different purposes, but we want to make sure that information is restricted in its access out there. So a lot of this is going to be internal private information within your organization or in your personal life. For integrity, if it's only integrity that we're worried about here, it's information that probably is public or more accessible, and we're less worried about confidentiality. Think about a public website. Everybody here would have a public website at your organization. You don't want unauthorized people to change your website. So you're most worried about the integrity. You're probably still worried a bit about confidentiality for log files and things like that. And you're probably a bit worried about availability of your website, but integrity is probably going to be a bit higher up on that peak. For here, we can use cryptographic hashing, where you can hash a file, save that hash in a database, and then come back later, do another hash, and see if it has changed. This is the basic concept of tripwire that was open source over 25 years ago, I think tripwire was out. You can also use encryption. Encryption is a good way of making sure that things don't get changed. However, you know, you're encrypting, so it's useful for things that are controlling confidentiality and integrity through that. And digital signatures is the type of hashing with extra crypto added on. And for availability, there's a lot of different ways that we can deal with it. Of course, the networking things that come in basic of redundancy and high availability are there. Making sure that you are patching your systems. By staying up to date with patches, make sure that vulnerabilities can't be exploited. A lot of vulnerabilities will actually crash or hang systems. Increasing resources. This may mean providing additional services, more memory, more bandwidth, if you need more availability. Make sure you've got backups and DR and BCP for when things go very wrong. Remember, planning for availability is not just when things are going well, but if something goes very, very wrong, how are we going to deal with that? If you're the subject of a very large distributed denial of service attack, how are you going to deal with that? If there is a fire in your data center and your equipment is damaged, how are you going to deal with that? Remembering, of course, that the main damage during a fire is from water because of sprinkler systems. Not every data center has gas-based systems that allow equipment to keep running. Or maybe the fire department turns up and hoses everything down with water as well. Water is a huge damage to computer data center systems. So you want to make sure that you have plans for availability to get you back up and running as quickly as possible. Okay, so that's a little bit on CIA. What else did we have here? Another one I'm going to throw in here is someone put up about DNS client security. That's just in a different folder. Give me one sec. This is a fun one. This is actually a presentation. I've given this DNS security one at a few different places, but believe it or not, I did this one for APAN 47. So I thought I'd dig out this slide deck from here. So let's skip to the good stuff because 12 o'clock is lunchtime, right? No, I don't want to keep people from lunch. So 12:30. Oh, I've got more time. Oh, okay. I thought I was running out of time quickly. Okay. So everybody should know DNS, right? Names to numbers, sometimes numbers to names, but not all the time. DNS is a very old protocol. Believe it or not, most of it still uses unencrypted UDP, and not a lot of people use DNSSEC yet. So life of a domain name. So you want a domain name, great. You pay to register a domain name with the registrar. It's not really buying it, it's more like renting it, but you know, sometimes we use the words that make it easy. The registrar will check with the appropriate registry database. The registrar then registers the domain name and configures the TLD root and the domain servers, and then everything works. Now, DNS can go wrong even before we talk about name servers. When you register a domain name, it stays registered through that registrar, right? Or through the registry. Let's just use GoDaddy, for example, because everybody loves picking on GoDaddy. If you register a domain name with GoDaddy, you can return to GoDaddy to update the information. If you're changing your primary name servers for the domain, you go back to GoDaddy. If you want to change who is an authorized contact, you go back to GoDaddy. Your account with GoDaddy is the only thing separating you from criminals trying to take over your domain. So if your registrar doesn't, if your registry doesn't have two-factor authentication, or if you're not using it, then it's literally just a username and a password sitting between you and them. And the thing is that in whois information, it says who the registry actually is. It says that you are using GoDaddy. In fact, with the current state of top-level domains and that, and .coms and nets and the generics, pretty much the only information they give out is who the registry actually is. So they don't give out your information, but they do give out GoDaddy, so they can trace you back through there. Now, someone else may have registered your domain name. If you don't renew your domain name, it may expire. Someone can come in and maybe snipe it away from you. And of course, malicious attackers, as I was saying, can break into your account. So, does your registrar support two-factor authentication? Are you using two-factor authentication? This is a really fun one down here. Will your registrar make changes to your domain record based on a fax or a written letter? Now, this is really old school. I remember doing this 25 some odd years ago, not the criminal side of it, but the corporate side of it, where you requested changes on company letterhead. Who has company letterhead that they have to put things on, or now it's just a Word document with company letterhead that you put on and save as a PDF and send off. But the thing is, company letterhead is not special. It's just some imagery of your organization, and it's not even a signature that can be compared. Letterhead changes over time. Sometimes GoDaddy or whoever the registrar is may not even have a record of what your letterhead looks like. So if this is a possibility, then it's really simple for attackers to go in and make changes to your domain name. So you may want to not just understand the normal way of updating your domain name, but talking to your registrar and saying, what other ways can criminals try and take over my domain name? Okay, so on to DNS as actual name server communication. So here we have a laptop computer. You try and do a lookup, or you're trying to visit google.com. The very first thing your computer does is looks to the local cache and your local host file. That's the very first place that it looks for information. If it gets a reply, it then carries on with life, converts name to number, and does the work. If it doesn't exist in the local cache or host file, then your laptop will talk to your local DNS resolver. So the example here, what's the IP address for www.apnic.net? From there, if the DNS resolver does not have a stored answer to that, it goes up to the root name servers. Now, this is a generic example, but it goes up to the root name servers. The root name servers don't know the full answer, but they do know .net is over at some top level or some generic top level domain servers. So it goes and asks those, hey, do you know the answer for www.apnic.net? They reply and say, I don't know about the www part, but I do know anything apnic.net is on apnic's name servers, and they are down there. So they ask the question, they finally get the answer because those are the authoritative name servers, and they send the reply back to the computer. At this point in time, the DNS resolver saves a copy of the answer. So if other people ask, it knows the answer right away. And the laptop computer will save the answer in its local cache as well, so that it doesn't even have to talk external if it needs it again. Now, where can DNS go wrong? Now, remember we talked about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those have impacts on DNS as well. So we'll break these down one piece at a time. So let's just look at this first part here. When you have your laptop computer, you can have a virus on your computer that will actually modify your host's file. Now, that just completely overrides DNS completely. And if it points something, then it will go there either to redirect or to block. One of the common ones for malware on a computer is taking your antivirus software updating server and putting it in as localhost into the hosts file. Now your antivirus is running, but it's not updating. So if the virus can get in before it's detected, it stops it from getting updates that will detect it in the future. And of course, you can even have malicious software changing the DNS settings. Now, here we actually have a laptop computer that is pointing to a totally different DNS server. Now, at that point, the attacker has full control over your DNS. They can pass everything through and back and not change anything at all. And then whenever they want, they can change any resolution to a different IP address. So if they only want to change your bank.com to go to a different IP, they can do that. And they can do it when they want and turn it on and off whenever they want, because they are running the name server that you are connecting to. So the next problem that we can look at here, DNS resolvers can be configured to modify answers. The resolver that you are using, is that one under your control, or is it your ISP's name server? There's some ISPs in America that actually will redirect non-existent queries. So if you type in a domain name by accident that is wrong, like google.com, normally you would get a response saying domain not found, NX domain. Some of these ISPs were then redirecting you to a site with ads and a site for the ISP and, you know, their search page and things like that, trying to steal your attention and to go somewhere different, mostly to make money. Attackers can also poison DNS resolvers to give fake responses. That's DNS cache poisoning or cache poisoning. And DNS resolvers can also block responses. This is a very common way of doing censoring of internet connections or filtering of internet connections. This is done by some countries, Australia included. It's done by some DNS resolvers as a way of filtering adult content or filtering gambling content. I actually use a special DNS resolver like this with my children, and I can configure what they have access to and block it at the DNS level. Really cool stuff. So some of that is bad if you're not expecting it, and some of it can be good if you're doing it on purpose. Now, another problem with DNS is that the security of DNS, like DNS is basically a postcard. So, you know, here we have a postcard going through the mail, and you can see who it's written to and who it's from, and you can see what the request is. You know, what's the IP address for www.apnic.net. So anybody in the middle can look at that postcard. It's just wide open, no encryption at all. So when we've got privacy like a postcard, DNS queries and responses are unencrypted, can be read by upstreams, can be read by the local network operator. Again, some of these things are good, and some of the, if it's done on purpose, and some of these may not be good if it's not done with your strict knowledge. Now, another problem that we have here is outsourcing of services. So for example, not everyone runs their own authoritative name server. If you are giving control of your authoritative zone file for your domain name to somebody else, then you're at the limits and restrictions of their security. If they have good security, then your domain name is well protected. If they have bad security, people can break into it and do things, especially if you use super cheap DNS hosting. I don't think that's a real company, by the way. I'm not implying that there is actually a company called super cheap DNS hosting. So any vulnerabilities that they have, if they have weak authentication, if they weakly authenticate you or anyone else in general, if they don't have two-factor, if they have vulnerabilities, all of those things will impact your domain name. And of course, denial of service attacks. This is a fun and interesting one that has been done in the past. DIN DNS or DYN DNS, DYN DNS, dynamic DNS. They were attacked a few years ago with, what was it, like 1 to 2 terabits per second of DDoS traffic. You know, it's like, who can handle 2 terabits per second of DDoS traffic? It's incredible. Most countries can't handle 2 terabits of DDoS. If the authoritative name servers go down for long enough, the domain is going to disappear off the internet. So Let's break this down into CIA. So, and then how to defend them. So confidentiality, obviously encryption. Integrity, we do the hash verification, and availability as redundancy. So let's look at how those work for DNS on the client side of things. First off, encryption. DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS are the two different solutions that we have right now for doing encryption of DNS requests and responses. These provide you that encrypted tunnel to whatever system it is that is doing the DNS resolution. So anybody in the middle is not going to be able to see those DNS queries. Again, if you're doing this on purpose, it's a good thing. If you're not doing this on purpose and you don't want to allow this, this can limit the inspection of DNS that's going across your networks and systems. If your filtering is relying upon DNS, you may not be able to filter some of the malicious activity or, out of policy activity, like filtering access to adult websites or gambling websites. So that was the confidentiality encryption or cryptography. For cryptographic hashes, this is where we can protect integrity of information. To make sure that DNS doesn't get modified along the way, this is where DNSSEC comes into play. Now, DNSSEC, while yes, it is DNS security, it's only one part of security. It's making sure the answer is correct and doesn't get changed. It does not protect you from other people seeing the request and answer. It's still unencrypted, but it provides a hash to make sure that you are checking and make sure the integrity is still there. And last but not least, for redundancy, pretty straightforward. Operate multiple authoritative name servers. Make sure these are diverse, and it makes it harder for denial of service attacks. It also makes sure that you can allow for maintenance downtimes and faster responses if you spread these geographically. And it may be a matter of using a professional service that has geographically spread and redundant and higher bandwidth and DDoS protection and everything like that as well. There are a few services out there that will do that sort of DNS protection. Beyond all of that, you also need to make sure that you are protecting your endpoints. The endpoints, remember, are the ones that are susceptible to a lot of things such as viruses and malware. So don't forget the basics. Antivirus software, users should not be running with administrator privileges. If a user is running administrator on their laptop and they execute a program that changes the host file, that program is running with administrator permissions, which is required to change the host file or to change the DNS settings. If you have a user running with user level permissions, where they do not have permission to change DNS or change the host file, if they run a virus by accident or intentionally, they are not able to make those changes. Also, of course, update operating systems to patch all the vulnerabilities that are there. And of course, there are different ways that you can protect systems. Remember, I said that for my children, I'm using a DNS filtering service. Not only does that let me filter out certain social media and adult websites and gambling websites and things, but these systems actually can filter out malicious websites. This is a common one for DNS RPZ or RPZ, response policy zones. This is something that you can configure on your own systems. If you have a feed of information, such as threat intelligence that we may talk about, this lets you block whatever you want. If you want to block certain domain names, or if you want to get a feed of information of malicious domains, you can go in and block those right at the beginning. If you don't want to set it up yourself, say you want to do it for home or even for some businesses, there are organizations like Quad9 that are providing not just DNS services, but they are filtering malicious domains only. So if you set your DNS to be 9.9.9.9, first off, you get a globally distributed DNS resolver infrastructure, and it blocks access to malicious domains. You know, a really simple example of where this can be useful. If you have a smart TV at home and it's more than 1 or 2 years old, it's probably not getting software updates. Might be working perfectly fine, but if it's not getting updates, that means as new vulnerabilities are found, they're not getting patched. So now you have an unpatched IoT device on your home network. If it were to get malware infected on it, it could then do many other things. But usually the first thing that malicious software does when it infects IoT is it calls home. It calls to a command and control server, usually as part of a botnet or other system. If it can't talk to the command and control server, then it's infected, but it's not doing anything. So a very simple thing that you can do, your home Wi-Fi router or devices, set it to something like 9999, and you're freely protecting your IoT devices that are possibly not getting software updates. There's other protection that you can do, changing passwords, putting firewall rules and everything else, but this is a nice little extra layer that you can put on for things. Cool. So DNS is complex. With complexity is risk. Make sure you identify all the gaps, especially on client-based DNS, and defense in depth. Remember that castle, we want to make sure that we have layers, and DNS is a good layer of protection for that. Cool. Any questions, by the way? I forgot to throw that out there before. I've gone through a few different topics in that. Does anybody have any questions at all? Yeah.
Because there are many domains, and each domain they will have to maintain a DNS server. I think maybe do you think that DNS as a service will be the future?
Providing DNS as services. Yeah. Yep. Yeah,
I think
there are a lot more companies providing DNS as a service, and it's interesting you mentioned that because I just saw a news article. A large internet provider in Australia has announced that they're going to stop running SMTP, the running mail servers. Well, not SMTP, like the POP servers, you know, like the email. So yeah, I think email and DNS is going to be more centralized into certain places because it is hard. If we look at DNS from the server perspective, you've got problems of misconfigurations. And if it's an open resolver, that's how DDoS attacks happen. So a DDoS attack is started not just by a criminal actor, but with servers that can amplify the DDoS attack. These are misconfigured DNS servers, NTP servers, and if you have old memcached. But yeah, if you run a DNS server, it does take a lot of work to make sure that it is configured properly, kept up to date, and is resilient against attack. So yeah, a lot of people are going to centralized hosting, going to Amazon using their DNS infrastructure, going to Cloudflare and using their DNS infrastructure. And putting that trust to them. The same way as email, a lot of people are going to Microsoft and using them for all of their email and everything. Same thing with Google and some other large mail hosting companies. But yeah, it's interesting seeing those services being more popular, and just anecdotally, I've seen more domains using centralized DNS servers rather than running their own DNS servers. So yeah, I think it would be going in that way. And of course, from home users, more people using 1.1.1.1 or 8.8.8.8. Or, you know, my preference would be something like 9.9.9.9. The one that I use with my children is Next DNS, but there's a few other competing ones as well. Some of them offer free tiers and then paid tiers, and you can choose what you want to block and filter. Really useful things on the DNS security side. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, I might just pass them on.
Yeah, hi.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
okay. It's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I think maybe it will improve the deployment of DNSSEC. Now it's very difficult to improve the deployment of DNSSEC.
Yes.
And I think maybe you can, my suggestion, you can give a deep investigation to the pros and cons of the future, the centralization.
Yep.
Just my suggestion.
So DNSSEC, especially for authoritative name servers, with encryption, encryption is a wonderful tool, but it's sort of like a gun. If you don't use it properly, you will shoot your fingers off, or your foot, or worse. DNSSEC to be deployed has to start from the root. So it has to start at the top level domain and then make sure that everybody on the chain actually supports it and does it properly. We have actually seen some top level domains deploying DNSSEC, and then when they do a key rollover, they make a mistake, and every domain underneath them is invalidated because it's not signed properly. Same thing then can happen at any layer. So if you're running your own name server and you're doing your own DNSSEC implementation and you make a mistake, you can make your domain disappear off the internet. That is generally a bad thing. So yeah, that's even more reason why some people are moving to these managed DNS services for their authoritative domain names, because then they just use like a web interface and their system on the back end rolls over DNSSEC, does the deployment, and just makes it easy. I won't lie, DNSSEC is hard. And with anything when it comes to cryptography, don't do it yourself unless you really know what you're doing. So yeah, you're absolutely right that that's another reason for that centralizing. You had a question at the back?
Thank you. I'm just thinking about the you were telling about the internal hackers or internal intruders. So is there any like policy, like global policy or global research papers, or like how do we prevent that? Because it's the hardest thing I have ever found, right? So if you do have an intruder inside, how do we prevent that? Are there any such standards and use?
Yep.
In global?
No, good question. So there are, again, layers that you want to be doing. One of the easiest layers to start with is your policies. Make sure that you have acceptable use policies and make it easy to define what is allowed behavior, but to also define what is not allowed. You know, if there is certain activity that you do not want people to do, if people are not allowed to install video games on their work computers, say that. Don't just say only use allowed software. You know, give some examples of where people have done things that are against policy and make it clear. Make sure your policies are well written. Make sure that you actually explain your policies to staff. If your policy lives under human resources and is kept over here, and that's the only place it's ever pulled out, that may not be enough. Because people may have to, you know, tick a box or sign a form when they start and say, I agree to all policies. Have they read them? And has it been explained to them? So an example, at APNEC, I actually ran a session when we were doing an update to our policies. I actually explain the policies in regular language, and we do question and answer. And people ask, you know, so does it mean I can do this? And I say yes or no. And then those question and answer help us to rewrite the policy to make it easier to understand. And then we recorded that video and we make that available so that new staff, new employees don't have to just read a document. They can also get this question and answer and explanation. Beyond policies on the technical side, this is where zero trust architecture and infrastructure comes into play. You can do fancy zero trust, but you can also go back to simpler security terminology and just say, need to know, minimum level of access, default to zero access, and only what is actually required. So if you give a network engineer access to do network engineering work, if they move to a different department, if they are no longer doing network engineering, they should lose those privileges. You don't want people moving around, gaining more and more access and keeping it from all of their previous roles if they don't need it anymore, and only giving the access that is needed. For example, the administrator access on laptops, that's a very common one. People will use that to do what they think they're allowed to do because technically they're not being blocked. If you remove the administrator access, give them user level access, and technically don't allow them to install new software, then they won't be able to. And that means that whether they're doing it with innocent intentions or they're doing it with malicious intentions, they won't be able to do that type of activity. So they won't be able to purposefully install a virus. They won't be able to purposefully try and, destroy systems and that. And then the only other layer that is easy to put on top of that is monitoring. Monitoring what the activity is that they're doing. If you want to do some fun things around here, this is where you can take honeypot technology and do either a honeypot system or honey tokens, sometimes called canary tokens. So these can be something as small as an individual file. And, admittedly, we do this at APNIC. I've done this on previous companies as well. You put one file on a file server that says something like senior executive salary review.xlsx. Ooh, sounds exciting, doesn't it? But it's not a real file. It's a file, but it has auditing turned on. Nobody should be accessing it because it's not a real file. It's not put there by the finance team. It's not put there by the senior executives. So if a regular user stumbles across and goes, oh, I want to see the senior executive salaries, and they try and open it, boom, hey, you were accessing something you shouldn't have. We've done an audit. We've found you. We know what you're doing. So you can do different sorts of honey tokens of individual files that you can do. You can do a whole range of things. Just search honey tokens and canaries. And there's systems where you can embed a call home into a PDF or a Word document. So not just someone accessing a Word document, but if they take a copy, go home and open it up, it does a call home and says, hey, someone's opened a security canary document. The IP address is this, and you can actually see where the document has been leaked out to and where it's gone out to. So some interesting things that can be done in there, but logging and auditing in general would be your extra layer of protection. But yeah, basic things: least privilege, zero trust infrastructure, honeypots, honey tokens. Those are all very useful things in that space. Any other questions anyone has up until this point? Where's the microphone?
In transition from DNS to DNSSEC,
Yes.
can we use the same sound file or do we have to have different format?
I'm not an expert at transitioning. You can, I believe, use the same zone file. It's just additional resource records and some extra bits and pieces. So you don't have to do, yeah, but for your domain, like for a single domain name, the whole domain has to get signed and put over to it. But yeah, you can use the same zone file from there.
So moving into DNSSEC, would there be any incompatibility issues with the top level authoritative DNSs?
You need to make sure that your top level is using DNSSEC. So if you're using a country code top level, that's where the problems might be. You have to check and make sure that they're doing it. You have to have signing all the way up through the path, up through the namespace tree. So the .coms, net, org, those are easy, but the country code, check with your top level registry to see if they're using it. And if they're not, put pressure on it and say, hey, we want to do DNSSEC and we need you to do it. So please do it, and tell them to do it correctly, because you don't want them to be like some of the other countries that destroyed the whole top level domain.
So it has, in brief, it has a sort of challenge whether we can access all the website in the world, right? Because on the other end, if it is not implemented in the other end, which I want to access, then still that problem would be there, right?
There's two parts to DNSSEC. So there's DNSSEC where you actually have to sign your domain name. Okay, so that's requirement one from you as an authoritative domain. The other part is then from the clients. Clients have to be validating it. Because if you have a client and a resolver that is not validating DNSSEC, it will get the records and it will just ignore the signatures, right? So if things get modified, they're not checking, they don't know. If it doesn't get modified, they're not checking, whatever, it doesn't matter. So from the server side, from the authoritative side, you have to be signed and all the way up to your root. From the client side, you have to be using a validating DNS resolver to make sure that it's checking and will block any responses that are being modified or changed on the way.
So probably that could be the challenge in enabling DNSSEC, right?
Yeah, you know, as with anything, you want to make sure that you have logging turned on so that if things are being blocked, you know why it's being blocked, and you can see whether it was maybe an error on your system or it was being modified. And, you know, the errors might be intentional, where somebody was man in the middle attacking and changing DNS, but it could be accidental that if the domain that is being blocked, if they did not roll over their keys properly, they might be blocking themselves. So the more logging, the better, because then if somebody says, hey, I can't access this website, you can quickly look up in the log on why it's being blocked, not just it is being blocked. But yeah, logs.
Yeah.
Always logs. But yeah, it does impose some new failure scenarios in DNS. But you have to remember, like, this is one of the last pieces of the internet that is not encrypted and not protected by default. Almost everything else is having a form of protection and encryption and security layered on by default. Yeah, so yeah, we really need to improve our DNS security game in general. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now we've only got a few minutes left till lunch. Oh, we've got a question at the back. If we could pass the microphone, please.
Hello, and I have the question about DNSSEC too. We know that the part of the DNSSEC is that we need to has the trust chain, right?
Yes.
And my teacher said our resolver default trust the root DNS key. Yeah, but when comes up the root DNS key need to be updated or it expire. Is any issue to protect the update process, the root DNS key, or any vulnerability about the root DNS key?
Unfortunately, I've never been involved in a deployment when the root's then being rolled over. So it's a great question. I can look into it and talk to some people at APNIC that have been involved in that scenario. But unfortunately, I don't know the answer for you. I would hope that there shouldn't be a problem. But I do know a lot of the top ones, when they do their rollover, they do it in advance and they communicate out. So yeah, it's either a matter that there's no problem and it just happens, or there's communication about the rollover for people to include additional information. But I'll look into that if you want and communicate. I've got my business cards here if you want to follow up with me.
Okay,
Send me
thank
an
you.
email after. Yeah. But yeah, I've never been involved with that scenario yet.
Because I have this problem is I got some rumors that last time when update the root DNS key have some problem and
Yeah.
it made some issue somehow. Yeah, so I'm curious about how to secure update the DNS key.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank
No,
you.
I think we've gone past it, but I'll check for you. But yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions that they want to ask in the last 2 minutes that we have? Cool. Threat intelligence. I'll just rip without slides for threat intelligence for 2 minutes. Threat intelligence means different things to different people. If you're ever talking to a vendor and they're saying, we have threat intelligence, find out what their definition is. Find out what it is, because it is different meanings to different people. Sometimes threat intelligence is the very technical aspect. You know, they will give you intelligence on malicious domain names if you want to add into your DNS RPZ to do blocking of those domain names. Sometimes the threat intelligence is about your own network, basically like vulnerability scanning, where they can tell you threat intelligence about your infrastructure. Other times, the threat intelligence may be at a higher level of telling you what types of hacker activity is happening out there. And it might be in the form of emails or briefings or videos even. So understanding what they mean, but also making sure that your systems can handle the use of that threat intelligence. For example, if you don't have security experts, then the information that you are bringing in has to be in a way that it's understood by the IT staff that maybe aren't specifically skilled in security. So it has to be at their level so that they can understand it. If you're getting automatic data feeds, you have to make sure that those data feeds can be used by your systems. Do you have a firewall that can actually ingest and automatically update based on threat intelligence? Do you have other systems like a SIEM or log analysis that can take in that threat intelligence and go back in time to see, you know, has this actually happened in the past few days as well as going forward? Some of the other problems that we've seen with threat intelligence is the expiry of threat intelligence. Just because one IP address was bad on this one point in time does not mean it's going to be bad 5 years from now. You know, if we start collectively adding up IP addresses with malicious activity, pretty soon we're going to be blocking the entire internet. So you have to look at when is the most recent malicious activity seen from these threat sources and making sure that it is still current if it's staying in your systems. Yeah, what else? There are so many different websites out there offering threat intelligence. You know, you need to basically get through the marketing information to get down to the technical details, but really make sure that it's working for you and your network. Also, depending upon how you're doing threat intelligence, you may want to make sure that you're spending money in the right place. A lot of people are after the new things, you know, AI and machine learning and threat intelligence and that. But if you don't have the basics done on protecting your network and your systems, then that's not going to be helping you. That's spending money on the different part of the timeline. That's spending on detect rather than spending on prevent. And you want to make sure that you spend equally across prevent, detect, and correct. So if you're not removing administrator access from laptops, you probably want to do that before threat intelligence. If you're not using two-factor authentication, you probably want to do that before going into advanced AI security and machine learning and TI on that. So look at some of these basics and make sure that you get a basic level understood first. In Australia, the government actually has a security framework, I guess is a word for it, called the Essential 8. And it's 8 essential activities that you should be doing on your network that will have the most impact and reduce the most attacks on your network. And that's from all of their experience doing incident response. The list is actually like 37 or 40 items long, but the Essential 8 are the essential items. For each of those 8, they actually have introduced recently a maturity model. So for item number 1, they have maturity 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. For item number 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the reason why I say this is because they make it very clear that if you are trying to implement the essential 8, you should be aiming for a base level across all 8. If you have one item that's at 4 and the other items that's at 1, your score is a 1. If you have the lowest item, that is your score in their scoring system. So if you have 4, 4, 4, 1, 4, 4, 4, 4, your score is a 1 because that is a weak point on your network, on all your systems. So you want to make sure, go across your security implementation, your security spend with limited budgets, and make sure you're getting a good baseline and getting all of that security at a good basic level before you start going for some of the advanced new technologies and things that may not have as much benefit as bringing everything up to a base level. Cool. I'm not going to keep people from lunch. I'm a little hungry as myself. Thank you very much. If people ask questions, I do have some prizes and things up here. If you just want an APNIC pen, you can come up and grab an APNIC pen as well. Thank you very much. If you were interested in the vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, come back in this room after lunch.